All right, let's dive into a really fascinating legal puzzle that comes to us from the Philippines more than 100 years ago. This case has it all. Two gamblers, a huge debt, and a legal fight that forced the Supreme Court to sort out this messy clash of legal traditions. It's a story all about how a debt could be totally illegal, but somehow also legally enforceable. And that's really the big question, isn't it? It sounds like a complete contradiction. I mean, how can an obligation that comes from something illegal, in this case gambling, get treated by a court like it's a legitimate contract? This is the very paradox the court had to solve. So, our story kicks off with a pretty high-stakes game of chance. But this wasn't just some friendly bet. Oh no, it blew up into a legal battle that would go on to test the very foundations of Philippine law. So here's the play-by-play. In late 1917, a guy named P.J. O'Brien loses a ton of money, 15,000 pesos, to Leung Ben in a few different games. Now, instead of just walking away, O'Brien decides he's going to sue to get his cash back. And he doesn't just stop there. He gets a court to freeze that exact amount right in Leung Ben's bank account. Let's just pause on that number for a second. Be 15,000 back in 1917. That was an absolute fortune. We're not talking about small claims court here. This was a massive financial hit. And that explains why both of these guys were ready to fight this thing all the way to the top. Okay, so O'Brien's move to freeze the money, it's a legal tactic called an attachment, was seriously clever. But Leung Ben fired back with an equally clever counterargument, and it was one that gave the courts a real headache. And here we are, at the very heart of the problem. On the one hand, O'Brien's lawsuit is based on a law that actually lets people who lose at illegal gambling get their money back. But, and this is a huge but, the legal tool he used, that attachment, can only be used for debts that come from a contract, express or implied. See the conflict? An illegal act over here, and a requirement for a contract over there. So, Leung Ben's argument was, shockingly simple, but also really powerful. He basically said, look, a debt from an illegal game, something the law itself says is bad, cannot possibly be a contract. A contract needs a lawful agreement. Therefore, he argued, the court had no legal right to freeze his money, and in doing so, it went way beyond its authority. So this whole mess escalates, right? It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. But before the justices could even start to unpack that central paradox, they had to answer a totally different question first. Did they even have the power to jump in this early, before the main case was even finished? So the court laid out a two-step plan for itself. First, could it use this special power, called a writ of certiorari, to immediately look at the freeze on the money? Or did Leung Ben just have to sit tight until the whole trial was over and then file a normal appeal? And only if they said yes to that first question could they move on to the big one. Is a gambling debt an implied contract? Well, on that first question, the court's answer was a resounding yes. They reasoned that having your money frozen illegally can cause real immediate damage, the kind of harm you can't just fix later with an appeal. They decided waiting just wasn't a plain, speedy, and adequate remedy. So, boom, the court confirmed it had the authority to rule on this right now. Okay, and that brought them right to the main event, the heart of the whole mystery. The entire case was now hanging on how you define one little legal phrase, implied contract. What in the world did the lawmakers actually mean by that? To solve this puzzle, the court had to dust off this fascinating legal idea called a quasi-contract. Now, the wild thing about a quasi-contract is that it's not a real contract at all. It's a legal fiction. It's an obligation a court imposes on someone just to make things fair and prevent them from keeping money that shouldn't be theirs. The logic basically goes like this. O'Brien lost money in a game that was illegal. The law says he gets that money back. So that means Leung Ben is holding money that legally he should return. Letting him keep it would be unjust enrichment. So to fix it, the law just steps in and says, we're going to pretend this duty to pay the money back is a contract. This way of thinking is a classic move in the Anglo-American common law system. And that, right there, was the key that unlocked the whole thing for the majority. They said, hey, the law that allows these attachments, the Code of Civil Procedure, it came from America. So they argued the phrase implied contract has to be seen through an American and English common law lens. And in that system, yeah, a legal duty to repay money like this is definitely considered a type of implied contract. So, based on all that reasoning, the court made its final call. The freeze on Leung Ben's P15,000? Totally legal. The attachment was going to stand. So let's just break that all down one more time. Could the court step in and review the case early? Yes. Was this gambling debt an implied contract? Yes, at least if you use the common law rulebook they decided to use. And so, the final verdict, Leung Ben's petition was denied. The freeze on his account was upheld. But hold on, because the story doesn't quite end there. This wasn't a unanimous decision, not by a long shot. In fact, one judge wrote a really powerful dissent, arguing that the majority got the meaning of contract completely wrong. And this disagreement, it revealed this deep clash between two entirely different legal worlds. Justice Fisher, in his dissent, just cut right to the heart of it with this killer question. He was basically asking, why are we digging up these old, foreign legal fictions to define a simple word when we have our own legal system right here in the Philippines? And this lays the fundamental disagreement bare. You had the majority, looking through a common law lens, who saw the word contract as a flexible tool, something you could even make up to get a fair result. And then you had the dissent, looking through a civil law lens, who is saying, no, 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 a contract needs consent. Always. An obligation that's forced on you by law is the literal opposite of a contract. See, Justice Fisher's whole point was that the court should have been looking at the Philippines Civil Code, not some American law. Under the Civil Code, a contract starts with consent. Full stop. He also pointed out that even in civil law, a quasi-contract has to come from a lawful act, and this case was all about an illegal act, gambling. To him, the majority was just shoehorning in a foreign idea where it just didn't belong. So you might be thinking, okay, cool story from 100 years ago, but why does it matter today? Well, because it perfectly captures this timeless debate in the law. Should judges be strict rule followers sticking to the literal definitions in their own law books? Or should they be more like flexible problem solvers, willing to bend terms and even borrow ideas to get to what they think is a fair result? And that's really the question I want to leave you with. When a court creates a legal fiction, like calling a gambling debt a contract, to make sure a law actually works the way it's supposed to, is that a brilliant act of justice? Or is it a dangerous game where you start bending the rules so far they're about to snap? That's a question lawyers and judges are still arguing about to this day.